This mighty vessel, still under construction, is the largest warship Britain has ever built.
This is 4.5 acres of sovereign territory. It's the largest, most complex warship that's ever been built in the UK. It's 2.5 times the size of Wembley Stadium. It's wider than the M25. From keel to the top of the mast, it's taller than Nelson's column. Designed to carry 36 F-35 jets, it has a huge amount of firepower. It can do humanitarian assistance, it can do command and control. It's the heart of an integrated task group, so it allows us to work with other nations.
But this massive carrier owes its very existence to the exploits of an elite squadron of Navy flyers, the top guns of the Great War.
A 100 years ago, when German U-boats and battleships were harassing the Allied fleet and the zeppelins were bombing the towns and cities of Britain, these young men were tasked with a dangerous mission aboard the Navy's mystery ship.
They blazed a trail for every Navy pilot that flew in their wake. But their task was difficult and dangerous, and they paid a heavy price. An Ulster-Scots teenager took part in that top-secret mission, aboard a ship called Furious. His name was Jack McCleery, and his record of their secret mission, their bravery and sacrifice will help me uncover one of the pioneering achievements of the First World War.
This is the story of Captain Jack and the Furious Few.
It's a very narrow sea between Scotland and the northeast of Ireland. This is the largest sea loch in the British Isles. At its closest point, where people have crossed for centuries, the ferry has to sail across one of the fastest flowing stretches of water in the world. Strangfjord, or Strongford, that's what the Vikings called it.
Even these great sailors found these waters challenging. This is where Jack McCleery learned to swim and sail, how to handle a boat, how to read the weather and the wind.
Once a busy shipbuilding port, Portaferry in County Down was home to the McCleery family for 300 years.
They were some of the lowland Scots who came here in great numbers in the 17th century.
One more part of the movement of folk between Scotland and Ulster that's been going on for centuries. Hard-working merchants and shipbuilders, over time this Ulster-Scots family became involved in another key local industry, linen. Jack was born in 1898 on the cusp of a new century, a modern age. As the firstborn son, he was expected to take his place in the family mill, starting as an apprentice. But Jack's life, like so many others, was about to change. When war broke out in Europe, young men all over Ireland enlisted with their friends and brothers. They called it a pals' war. In July 1916, in just 2 days of fighting, the Ulster Division suffered horrendous casualties at the Somme.
From high up in the mill, it must have seemed to Jack he was looking at a city in mourning. Families waiting in dread for the red bicycles of the telegraph boys. As blinds were drawn in house after house, it must have seemed that everyone in the city had been touched by the tragedy, as Belfast fell silent.
I wonder if Jack was thinking of something his father said to him a few years earlier when he asked him, "Have you ever yet had a wish to do something for your country?" What Jack did for his country would have remained untold were it not for the record he kept of his teenage years.
He even signed this one, J. McCleery, 1913.
13, but that's more amateurish.
He would have been 15 then.
Yes.
Just a lad.
His archive sheds new light on a top-secret naval experiment and a mission that would revolutionise warfare. Jack's son John is its custodian.
John, you've got a wonderful treasure trove here of your father's letters, his important diaries, you've got photographs. What did it feel like when you unearthed them all?
Well, I discovered them when my mother moved house after his death, because the garage had to be emptied. I first saw them when I was pretty young and really didn't pay great interest in them. Half of the stuff was old letters and things, and the other half was photograph albums, just memorabilia from the war.
Did you ever ask your father about his wartime exploits? Were you in any way interested when you were a younger man?
Not really. He really didn't encourage me, and it never occurred to me. I do remember making a remark that really these things don't look half as interesting as Captain W.E. Johns and Biggles.
It was only when John shared his dad's real-life wartime memories with writer and historian Guy Warner that the archive's historical value began to be appreciated.
My eyes nearly popped out of my head when he brought out this large black tin trunk and opened it up to show me inside there was contemporary letters written by Jack in 1917-18. There were the diaries that he completed on a day-to-day basis in the same period. There were photograph albums not only containing well-known official photographs, but also images that Jack had taken himself with his own camera, or photos that had been taken of him, the sort of the selfies of their day. And these were photos that hadn't seen the light of day for 90 years. It was an absolute treasure trove.
And before the war and the danger to come, Jack's photos are also a snapshot of young men with their whole lives ahead of them.
Who are these rogues on motorcycle?
Well, that's Jack and his brother Tony, who was a better motorcyclist, in truth.
Hey, it's all competitive because they're all numbered.
Yes, it must have been some race. And Jack enjoyed motorbikes. They loved motorbikes. That's George, and he was Jack's best friend, lived near at home, and the parents knew each other. And he joined the RNAS as well. They stuck together. They worked in the same part of Belfast, so they were good friends.
Was there any history of flying in your family before he took it up?
Not a sausage, no. Not a thing.
So he was the black sheep in a sense. I'm going to be a pilot.
Yes, I don't know how it got into his head. He may have seen one or two air demonstrations, I'm told, in the King's Hall.
When the Wright brothers flew for the first time in 1903, no one really knew how these newfangled machines might be used. 11 years later, the world was at war. The Fleet Air Arm Museum in Somerset is home to a unique collection tracing the history of aircraft from the earliest days of flight to their constantly evolving role in naval combat. When the First World War began, aircraft were used primarily for reconnaissance. From 1,000 feet up, a pilot could see as far as 40 miles.
Anything which can get you higher than the deck of the ship starts to gain you that extra advantage of information. If you can use the aircraft in a sense like a mobile crow's nest, it can now take off, move away from the ship, rove around many, many miles away from the ship and bring the information back.
Once they realised that the Germans were trying to put aircraft to sea, they then thought about how do we shoot these down, or how do we shoot down the zeppelins that are spying on us. So the Navy very rapidly developed reconnaissance, bombing, fighting as the three main attributes, and of course that's still true to this day.
Both sides experimented with new technology, advantage shifting with each new innovation. And as the frantic race for aerial superiority continued, young men like Jack were dreaming and scheming. about how they might get airborne.
John, I love this letter. It's from the Lord Mayor of Belfast to the Secretary of the Admiralty in London. Dear Sir, some little time ago, Mr. Jack McCleery applied for a temporary commission in the Royal Naval Air Service, and I'd be glad if his application could be favourably considered.
He was turned down by one of the branches and then had to make a second attempt to... I can't remember the detail, to be honest, but I have it all somewhere.
It's time for every boy to be a soldier, to put his strength and courage.
In October 1916, after his interview with the Royal Naval Air Service, Jack sent the first of many letters he would write home during the course of the war. Went to Admiralty, and there to communicate results to me. I'm certain I'm through. Tell you all later.
What was the Navy looking for when it was recruiting young men for pilots?
People that were ready to be in the next generation of technology, people that wanted to be doing the next new thing, something that nobody had ever done before. And flying, of course, was very much part of that era. Brave, adventurous. Tell me somebody now that wouldn't want to fly a Spitfire or a Sea Harrier or an F-35 fighter. There's that something in many people that makes them want to be part of that exciting opportunity.
Now there's a lovely photograph, and that was 1917.
Yes. And it really is incredible what those young men did at that age.
So that must have created some anxiety in his mother and father, your grandparents.
Grandfather and grandmother, were all too conscious, but they never referred to the dangers. They just wished him well in their letters. Said, God bless you, and all this sort of thing.
So what faced them? What was their training like, the basic training?
Basic is the word, very basic. I mean, you have to think that man had actually not been flying for too many years. The Wright brothers had flown for the first time successfully with man-powered flight in 1903. So really, it still is in the early stages of learning to fly. And man was still learning and developing their flying skills at that time. So all of the early flying was almost an experiment every time they took off, and very dangerous, of course, as well.
Just a month after Jack started basic training, he wrote home to tell his best friend George about a very special day. Dear old George, yes, I've been up. Absolutely ripping, grand, gorgeous, splendid, etc., etc. I was up for about 10 minutes this morning in a Morris, and up to about 1,200 feet. First of all, you were strapped in, then you hear along the ground at about 50. And then, without any warning, you find you're up in the air. It's simply fine. I'll dream about it tonight.
Jack delighted in flying from the very first minute that he went up in the air. And every single piece of his flying training, as reflected in his letters and his diary, was complete joy to him.
Jack had served his apprenticeship around mill machinery, but it was his love of motorbikes, tinkering with their engines and racing them against his friends, that now helped him become an exceptional pilot.
A lot of the engines in aircraft were not that far removed from motorcycle engines of the time. So if they knew how to ride their motorcycles and adjust the air control, the choke, the throttle, the magneto, the advanced, the retard, that would be very familiar to them, and that would be essential for flying an aircraft. Balance was also important, so motorcycle riders would have a natural balance ability, so would horse riders. So where you turn and you move and you lean and you bank and you stay in control of your horse or your machine, all of those things together would help. It was a combination of skills that you needed.
And as he went from the basic training aircraft to more and more powerful aircraft, he delighted in each one.
But make no mistake, this was a deadly business. The life expectancy of a new pilot in 1917 was a mere 11 days. The aircraft they were flying were flimsy and dangerous. Parachutes were deemed surplus to requirements. Of the 14,000 British pilots who died in the war, a staggering 8,000 were killed in training. went up in a Newport before breakfast, made 2 landings and crashed the second one, wrecked undercarriage, prop and wings. No more flying.
Very dangerous indeed, and in some ways it could almost be self-selecting in that the pilots that were perhaps not going to make the grade as good pilots might actually meet with a fatality or an unfortunate accident very early on in their flying training. But the accident rate was very, very high. The aircraft were very basic. The flying of the aircraft demanded a lot of concentration and a lot of second-by-second skills and judgments. And if you've never flown before, you can very, very easily get that wrong, and your life can be on a knife edge within seconds.
March brought an awful reminder of just how dangerous this job could be. An awful lot of crashes, which wound up by a chap called Dalglish coming down upside down from 10,000 feet and killing himself. It fairly put the wind up everyone. There were either 8 or 10 crashes, one being a collision. I went up to 4,000 feet but had to come down as my head went very bad. I hope my nerves aren't going.
Not everybody would make it, but man has always wanted to fly, and doesn't that seem and feel better than being down amongst the mud and the bullets and the gas down on the ground? And I wonder if they really thought and considered about how short their life expectancy was, and who actually thinks, I'm only going to live another 10 days. Everybody thinks they're going to live forever.
Jack's diaries are full of crashes and fatalities. Now with first-hand experience of the dangers, his letters home reveal concern for his best friend, George Heriot, who had followed him into the service. George seems to be all right. I don't know whether I told you he crashed a Morris some time ago. Undercarriage, I think. So of course he was all right. I wouldn't say anything to Mrs. H.
Jack was a good pilot. He went solo after 2¼ hours, which is a fairly short time before going solo. The Royal Navy doesn't hand out praise easily, or the fair fact that Jack got very good reports from each of his commanding officers and instructors showed that he was regarded from the beginning as one to watch.
He was flying in every sense of the word. He noted every time he was in the air, including the praise from his instructors. He was working hard, spending as much time in the air as possible, and beginning to outstrip his colleagues. Though a modest young man, you can tell that he was very proud of the pilot he was becoming. Jack's superiors sent him for advanced training at the experimental seaplane base on the Isle of Grain in Kent, where their best pilots were encouraged to push themselves and their machines to the limit.
These were almost like the Top Gun fighters of their day. Whilst learning flying still themselves, were adding very, very much more to the possibilities and capabilities that early flight could give the Royal Navy.
Gifted pilots like Jack were being fast-tracked for a reason. By 1917, German submarines were wreaking havoc on Allied shipping, zeppelins threatening British cities. Urgently in need of a new strategy, the Navy hoped that a large, fast ship operating from the middle of the sea would allow them to increase the capability of their aircraft. Pilots could scout ahead of the fleet, warn of enemy attacks, and intercept zeppelins before they reached the British coast. But nothing like this had ever been attempted before.
Like so many things, it was the necessity of war and the necessity of needing to respond to how you were being attacked and how do you defend against that. Those things together started to form that necessity of the aircraft carrier. Can we take more aircraft to sea? Can we operate them from sea? Can we land them back onto the same ship that they've taken off from?
The Navy had a ship in mind, a battle cruiser, already under construction. Like her sister ship Glorious, she was long and fast with 2 great guns fore and aft, and they named her Furious.
This new breed was able to keep up with the fastest elements of the battlecruiser fleet. She could provide the reconnaissance and the fighter cover above the fleet. That was the whole idea of Furious, that she would work with the fleet, but not be at a disadvantage in terms of either armour or speed.
Furious was urgently refitted, her forward gun replaced by a broad flight deck. She had just become the world's first aircraft carrier. But for her mission to succeed, she would need the Navy's finest.
The top pilots went to the Isle of Grain and honed their skills. If Jack and the rest of the pilots had been posted to Furious without honing their skills, they wouldn't have been as capable of tackling the challenges of a completely new environment, the first aircraft carrier.
To assemble the small team for Furious, the Navy turned to one of their most gifted pilots, the charismatic squadron commander, Edwin Harris Dunning. Already decorated for bravery, he was a pioneer who wanted only the very best pilots for what would be a flight into the unknown.
Furious was an experiment, and Dunning was appointed to bring his aeronautical skills to bear, to find out what was possible and simply what wasn't possible. Only 12 were picked in the first group to fly from HMS Furious.
This is the last remaining British ship still afloat from the First World War. Now a Royal Naval Museum in Belfast, this light cruiser saw fierce action in the North Sea. This is HMS Caroline. She was part of the Grand Fleet. She survived the Battle of Jutland, and in 1918 she supported Furious as they patrolled looking for German minesweepers off the Danish coast. Jack would have known her very well. With so many of her historic features still intact, this is a chance for me to get some sense of what Jack's life aboard a warship from that period might have been like. The 30th of June was the day Jack first saw the ship that would be home for the next 2 years, and words failed him. Arrived on Furious, 6 o'clock, some ship. Writing to George, he described the camaraderie and his first experience on board. We're sleeping in hammocks, and of course had the usual rough house for the first night. One hammock was down 5 times. Still, they are very comfy really. I had a bath this morning, hot. We should be very comfy on board as far as I can see, but we'll be very busy, I suspect.
Furious was known as the secret ship or the hush-hush ship. It was a voyage of discovery. Nobody really knew what was going to happen on board Furious. They were going to be working out the techniques there. For all the pilots, it was a leap in the dark. So, using Jack's letters and his diaries and his photographs, we are gaining a unique insight, getting right inside the mind of a man who was there at the time.
Was up in short after lunch, engine oiled up 3 times with me. Night watch 8 till 12, awfully cold. Heard a captain tell our skipper, this will be the most useful ship in the service.
They weren't just pilots. They were very rapidly given duties as watchkeeping officers. And Jack was also given the extra duty of being in charge of one of the 5.5-inch guns. So by no means were they just going to have a nice time on board ship swanning around doing a little bit of flying.
Wednesday, July 4th. Left Rosyth for Scapa Flow. On watch from 8 till 12:30 this morning. Rotten, cold job. Also tonight from 8 to 12. Ship did about 31 knots in speed trial. Strategically poised just off the north coast of Scotland, the Orkney Islands encircle a 120 square mile stretch of water known as Scapa Flow. One of the world's greatest natural harbours, this was where the Royal Navy stood ready to stop any attempt by the German fleet to break out into the Atlantic. Orkney was marked by 2 world wars. My father was stationed here during the Second World War as a chief petty officer, gunner instructor, and he tells a story about Winston Churchill coming before he was made Prime Minister. And he was introduced to him and he said, "Winston, how on earth can I defend the Grand Fleet? I've got plenty of guns, but I've got no ammunition." And the response was, "You will get your ammunition, dear boy." And within 2 weeks, true to his word, came in ammunition. Now, when Jack was here during the First World War, he was one of over 100,000 military and naval personnel stationed here.
Even before the war, they referred to Scapa Flow as being the stopper in the North Sea bottle. The Grand Fleet, which was based here, was something like 120 vessels. In amongst that, there are about 100,000 sailors. Not that many of those ashore during the First World War. For a lot of them, all they saw of Orkney was the shores from the middle of Scapa Flow, and from there, it looks like quite a barren place. A lot of the time spent on board ship, routine there, just swinging around at anchor, it must have been fairly dull.
As well as his photography and the diary and letters home, Jack found other ways to amuse himself during the long days at sea.
John, the sketches your father made, he was a very gifted artist, I think.
Now, those are nice.
They are nice. Bristol fighters.
Don't know about that.
Very flighty young woman.
That'll be Daddy. Just a bit of fun. And these will be ships probably anchored next door to Furious.
This is from Scapa Flow in Orkney.
Yes.
When HMS Furious arrived at Scapa Flow, the period they were entering into was working up, making the ship capable for operations, testing all the systems, all the weapons. In Furious's case, you are now going to be testing the unknowns. What do we do with these aeroplanes? What conditions can we use them in? What's the most practical way of using them? Where can they go? A huge number of unknowns. This was a massive undertaking, and I don't think I could emphasise too strongly just what a leap in the dark this was. This was at the absolute forefront of naval aviation in 1917. There was nobody in the world who was doing anything more advanced than the crew on board HMS Furious.
Just 4 days after arriving at Scapa Flow, the reality of life at sea and the danger of their mission hit home. An accidental explosion sank the battleship Vanguard, with the loss of over 800 lives.
HMS Vanguard blew up at anchor right in the middle of Scapa Flow. There'd been cordite in the magazine that had overheated and had detonated, and so the whole ship went up, and 843 were killed, most of them almost instantaneously. There are only 2 survivors.
Though every sailor in the Grand Fleet that night feared that a German U-boat was responsible, this accident would be the worst in the Royal Navy's wartime history. 4 weeks later, Jack witnessed the awful sight as one of the very few bodies to be recovered was pulled from the sea. But there was little time for grief. HMS Furious and Jack's squadron commander were on a mission and expected to deliver results.
Dunning was under pressure from the Grand Fleet, from Admiral Beatty. Find out what Furious can do as quickly as possible and put her to work.
Flew off the deck for the first time, Dunning very pleased, and said it was the best one done yet, especially his engine was dud. Praise from his squadron leader, Edwin Dunning, must have meant a lot to young Jack. He'd recruited them all. They not only liked him, they admired him. He was the best pilot on board, and he was only 25.
Dunning was a pioneer in these early days of naval aviation. The perfect man to lead these test missions. He delighted in the skill of his boys. These were busy and stressful times for Jack and Furious. They were kept hard at it, exercising both at anchor and underway. It may not look much, but to the pilots of HMS Furious, this was familiar ground. After taking off from the deck of a moving ship, this is where they landed.
We're right on the edge of a very important airstrip called Smugro. My Uncle Eddie, he would have been watching the planes take off from across the bay there. He would have had a terrific view.
Must have been exciting for teenage boys to watch it all.
It must have been exceptionally exciting because before the war, you can imagine how quiet Orkney was. There was a pier built here in 1845, so the Navy put a crane on it, and this crane was used to put planes on rafts and take them out to the ships in Scapa Flow, and then they would have been craned onto the ships. There was various things going on in this airstrip at the time, but obviously the most significant thing that happened was Captain Dunning's exploits.
Pilots could already take off from a deck, but more often than not, they had to ditch in the sea. Hopefully close enough that both pilot and what was left of his plane could be hauled to safety. Dunning was convinced they could transform air support for the fleet if they could answer the question that now obsessed them all: how to land on a moving ship. On August the 2nd, in near-perfect weather conditions, he took off from Smugro and made his approach across the bay exactly as he had practiced. A mile and a half out to sea, Furious's crew watched nervously from her deck.
There's not a lot of point taking aircraft to sea and losing one every time it takes off because it has to land back in the sea again. Trying to prove the concept of Furious as an aircraft carrier was a major task given to the squadron, and in particular to Squadron Commander Dunning.
These guys had to ditch if they couldn't get back to the ship. I can imagine he would have been thinking, it'd be a lot easier if I could just land on this ship.
People had taken off from ships up to that point in time. Nobody had managed to land back on the same ship, and that was going to be the big stepping stone to how effective taking aircraft were.
HMS Furious would be heading into the wind, and the idea was that if the speed of the ship matched the airspeed, the speed of the plane relative to the ship was almost zero.
Landing onto a stationary deck was one thing, but landing onto a deck at sea, the ship would be moving, the ship would be heaving and rolling, there would be strange wind and turbulence coming across the foredeck. All of that had to be encountered, as well as him moving down the side of the ship and actually having to weave in front of the superstructure and try and land on a very, very short deck.
He would have had to go in past the superstructure, avoid the turbulence, side slip it in and drop it down.
The deck was only about 10 times the length of his own Sopwith pup, so he had very little length of deck to land on and then come to a halt. No brakes on the aircraft, it was only a tail skid. He actually had to rely on other sailors running out from the side catwalks and grabbing part of the airplane and actually pulling him to a halt. So the whole thing was very, very seat of the pants, very, very experimental, very, very rudimentary attempt at this landing onto a ship.
Dunning's boys, Jack among them, ran to catch hold of his plane as he touched down. You can only imagine how they must have felt when their commander climbed out of the plane, the first man ever to have landed on a moving ship. Dunning had risked everything to prove it could be done. Furious's log records his touchdown at 11 a.m. The future of warfare at sea changed in that moment.
Furious became that massive step forward. The British Royal Navy performed landing back onto a ship moving at sea for the first time, and that was the proving point that meant you could do a lot more with the aircraft.
But once was not enough. Dunning had to prove that a deck landing on a moving ship was consistently achievable, and his fierce passion that it could be done drove him on. But he led from the front. Rather than risk his boys, Dunning put himself in the pilot's seat. August 7th was gusty and unpredictable. Dunning made a second deck landing but damaged the tail, so he changed planes to attempt a third. On approach, the engine choked and stalled, and Dunning's plane came in too steeply.
He hit the deck with quite a bang. Plane went over the side. The Furious was steaming into the wind. By the time they turned round, it was about 20 minutes before they got back to him. He had been knocked out and he drowned in the cockpit.
Jack tells us that Captain Nicholson gathered his men to speak about Dunning's death. He didn't record his words, but an entry in his diary the following day read simply, "Very cut up." They had lost their leader. But as the Admiralty said to his family, his sacrifice proved that aeroplanes were indispensable to the fleet.
We don't learn anything new unless we take risks. And that's the story of aviation. Risk-taking test pilots who give their lives in order to develop a concept. But he was the first pilot to make a successful landing on board an aircraft carrier, which is enough to secure his place in history.
Every deck landing by every carrier pilot since owes something to Edwin Dunning's success and his sacrifice. Though deck landings were suspended after Dunning's death, the point had been proved and the ship's importance realised. Furious was recalled to Rosyth to await further orders. By September, morale was low. Still dealing with Dunning's death, Jack and others began to feel that confidence was leaving them.
Jack was just 19. Since enlisting in 1 year, he'd faced death, combat, and the horrors of war at sea. But 1 week in November 1917 was to prove to be the darkest time of his life.
Throw out the lifeline across the dark wave. There is a brother whom someone should save.
I've just received Father's note. The news has come as an awful shock to me. But as I have seen nothing in the papers, I'm hoping he's still alive. I would have had your letter earlier, only we're just back to sea after some pretty bad experiences. Somehow I feel as if I can never be quite the same again if George has gone.
The death of his best friend, George Heriot, in training, affected Jack immensely. It was probably the hardest thing that he had to bear during the whole war. Jack probably thought about George nearly every day of his life.
It is true about George. How I will miss him if I get out of this war. He was the finest, straightest and best-hearted friend I've ever had, or could ever hope to have. I couldn't sleep last night much for thinking of him, the times we had together, the times we were both looking forward to. And now he's gone. There is a blank in my life now, and it will take some filling.
Jack had little time to mourn the loss of his friend. Furious, now based at Rosyth on the Firth of Forth and awaiting word of a major refit, was a very busy ship. When not acting as duty officer, Jack was flying reconnaissance.
It was dangerous work. Limping home from a particularly tricky mission in August, he almost hit the Forth Bridge. In October, when his engine failed, it almost happened again. He missed the bridge by a mere 50 feet. This was in a week when 2 pilots died. It seemed that Jack's luck was holding out.
It wasn't all work and duty. The diary entry for January 22nd records a rare treat, a trip to the cinema. The Furious few came to an Edinburgh picture house to see what Jack describes as a very good show.
And this is what they saw on the silver screen that day. Themselves. Can you imagine the excitement of these young pilots watching this Navy newsreel?
Even better, this propaganda film allowed the families a window into their world, and perhaps even catch a glimpse of a son or a brother who was so very far from home.
Furious had a flying off deck on the bow of the ship only, which allowed an aircraft to take off. And as Dunning proved, you could very, very precariously land back on. It became an obvious next stage that what you needed to do was approach the ship from behind and try and land onto a deck from the stern of the ship.
By March 1918, the reborn Furious had become a dazzle ship. Her old battleship grey replaced by camouflage streaks. A 300-foot landing deck over a new hangar at the stern had replaced the aft gun turret. The pilots opposed this change. They wanted a full-length flight deck. But Furious was needed back in action, and conversion to a flat-deck carrier would have taken too long.
Not the ideal solution, another experiment, thinking to themselves, would this work?
8 months after Dunning's death, deck landing trials were resumed, but they were not going well.
The thinking was right, the theory was there, but whilst the ship was moving at sea to get the speeds for the landing and the approach of the aircraft safely right, you then still had this invisible turbulent air that was now buffeting around behind the superstructure, causing all kinds of problems when the pilots reached that critical last moment where they had to be just making the touchdown. The aircraft would be billowing around out of control. So there were lots of problems.
Lovely day. Jackson landed on deck. Horrible sight. But Tyne trying it put the wind up me terribly, and most other people. I didn't feel right for nearly 1 hour after it. He just missed death by about 6 inches several times. Then we stopped trying it and flew back.
In most cases, it involved a crash. They certainly proved that it was possible to land and walk away from the crash. What they didn't prove was that it was possible to do this consistently.
It's by far the most risky job I've come against. It's obvious it's a washout. But I suppose they'll go on until someone's killed before they stop it.
They tried skids on the aircraft, the addition of arrestor wires and a large safety net, but the crashes continued.
Rutland landed and was blown up against the coaming. The deck party rushed out to catch him, but machine blown over the side about a second too quick for them. I saw pilot dropping out and the machine going after him. Terrible sight, and shook me properly.
Rutland had a narrow escape. 10 out of 13 landing attempts ended in crashes. The Sopwith pups were too light to cope with the turbulence caused by the ship's superstructure. To see if a heavier craft might fare better, they experimented with the 1.5 strutter, Jack's plane.
He was tasked with the job of doing touch-and-go landings on the foredeck. He would approach from aft, he would skirt his way around the superstructure and then side-slip to land on the deck, but as soon as the skids hit the deck, he would gun the engine to full power and take off again, a touch-and-go. It's extremely dangerous and no doubt very, very hairy for Jack. One of the touch-and-go landings he made, the propeller hit the deck and he lost about 8 inches off each end of his prop. He was able to recover to dry land and made a very successful crash landing, i.e. any landing you can walk away from is a good landing.
After experimenting with this dangerous manoeuvre, deck landings were again suspended and Jack found himself back flying reconnaissance missions.
Furious would approach the enemy coast. Jack and his observer would take off. Their task was to find out where the enemy was, at fairly low level so as they could actually see what was going on. And they were subject to being shot at by enemy warships and to being attacked by enemy fighters.
Sighted 6 enemy minesweepers and a torpedo boat destroyer. They did not fire. 20 minutes later, 2 seaplanes left the water and gave chase, shook them off in the clouds, followed the coast and landed there beside HMS Wessex. Tail broke up in the sea, our undercarriage stove in the whaler, and when we got to the ship we had to jump for the lifelines as she was sinking.
The strain was beginning to tell on him. He had been at war in the North Sea for a good number of months. He had carried out quite a few dangerous flights, and at some time he was starting to think, as many pilots do, my luck must run out one of these days. The strain was immense, and he started to suffer from what would today be called PTSD.
Time and again, during this period, Jack's diary reveals his distress, but he made sure to keep it from his family.
Jack censored his letters in comparison to what he put in his diary. He made light of the dangers that he is facing in order that he wouldn't worry his mum and dad too much. Jack was still his mum's little boy.
Just before I close, I want to ask you if I can have your permission to smoke, as sometimes nowadays I wish I could. I know you don't like it, but, well, I don't know what to say. He wrote this letter home in May 1918. He had lasted that long in the Navy without succumbing to the perils of tobacco. Strange to think that this young man who had faced so much danger had to ask his dad for permission to smoke. By April, the Royal Naval Service had been absorbed into a new Royal Air Force. But one of the Navy's long-held goals was soon to be realised. Zeppelins were still a relentless menace, and with Britain's planes operating at maximum range and in limited numbers, the threat persisted.
But with Furious refitted, it was a very different story. And so in the early hours of Friday the 19th of July, Jack was, once again, on the front line of history.
Tondern in Denmark was a key Zeppelin base and safely out of reach of Britain's fighter planes and small bombers to attack in numbers. But what if you could close the distance? Hit the Zeppelins hard by destroying them at their base rather than in the air? Furious was about to turn the established rules of warfare on their head. This was the moment when she came into her own.
This was a stepping stone. This was a planned attack. You could take 6 or 7 aircraft en masse, float them to the place that you needed them, carry out your attack. This was effectively like taking your airfield and manoeuvring it to where you wanted. So this was the start point of carrier technology as we understand it today.
With the mission green-lit, there was debate about the best planes for the job. Jack's reconnaissance plane, the long-range Sopwith Strutter, was their first choice.
1.5 strutters were becoming quite rare, and they were much too useful in a reconnaissance role for 7 of them to go on a one-way mission.
Instead of flying on the raid, Jack had to settle for being part of the support crew. But once again, he witnessed another first from HMS Furious as the chosen planes took off. The Tondern raid was the world's first carrier-borne strike on an enemy airbase.
Taking the aircraft 12 miles from the target at sea and launching a 2-wave attack with aircraft, that was a huge, huge shock to the German defences, and suddenly they were able to be intercepted by small fighters and bombers where they didn't expect to. And of course the raid was quite a success, and such was the shock and surprise the Germans actually withdrew from Tondern's Zeppelin flying field and took the Zeppelin operation much, much further back into their territory.
Tondern raid was deeply significant as an important part of the development of air power at sea. It showed how important aircraft carriers would become.
Monday, October the 21st, 1918, and for once, there was good news. Just another short note as I'm in an awful hurry to get it posted. Well, I'm captain and flight commander now, dated back to August the 8th this year. You can imagine how braced I am with life. Captain McCleery. Yes, sounds all right, doesn't it? And what's more, several people higher up were good enough to say I well earned it. Captain Jack has a great ring to it, doesn't it? I mean, after all the hard work, the pain and the grief, he was that excited young boy again who couldn't wait to write home after his first flight 2 years earlier. He was only 20.
I think becoming a captain, and in fact becoming the temporary commanding officer of Furious' squadron at the very end of the war, would have given Jack a quiet glow of achievement. He had been offered a more senior position ashore, which he had turned down as he wanted to remain on board Furious. And this, of course, was a young man of only 20 years old, who in 2 years had matured incredibly.
Got the official news of the armistice being signed early this morning. Not much work done. After dinner tonight, the fun started. All the searchlights in the Grand Fleet began to give a show. Well, I'm glad and proud to be able to say that I've been on the most active service ship in the fleet and one with probably the most dangerous work of any of the big ships. I'll feel very sorry to leave the sea. It has a fascination for me. But at any rate, I hope to finish by flying over the Hun fleet when it is given over to us. And Jack with his camera did just that, photographing the surrender of the German fleet, the greatest gathering of warships the world had ever witnessed. That same night, when a journalist reported from HMS Furious, Jack was standing right beside him. His report described her as one of the strangest ships in the fleet. Walking along her vast, unguarded deck was like walking on the roof of the world. And he paid tribute to Dunning's Landing as he watched the Furious few celebrate one of the greatest nights in British history.
Furious is a linchpin. Furious is a huge step forward. Almost as big a step forward in the terms of the Wright brothers performing flight for the first time.
We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Naval pilots today would readily admit that they're standing on the shoulders of the pilots of HMS Furious, who proved that operating from sea was possible.
Here in the Firth of Forth, where Furious was stationed towards the end of the war, the Royal Navy's newest aircraft carrier is about to begin her own chapter of this ongoing story.
Well, as Jack himself might have said, some ship. I wonder what the crew of the Furious would have thought of this 4-acre flight deck on board Britain's newest ship, as it takes the legacy of the Furious into the 21st century.
Carrier development from HMS Furious has been just that, a constant development program right the way up to the 21st century. The key to it is still, how do we take multiple aircraft to sea, float them anywhere around the globe, and have it ready to operate, whether it's combat, whether it's humanitarian aid. That's been the desire since Furious back in World War I. That's what's still happening today with the QE-class carriers.
In some ways, life on board a ship like this would still be familiar to Jack and his pals. The routine watches, the communal living, the forging of a team in the harsh environment of the sea. They could never have imagined the changes that 100 years of technology would bring. But the lessons they learned and the tactics they helped develop would prove decisive in future confrontations. How to take off and land at sea, to establish air supremacy, to use planes offensively, to protect civilians from aerial attack, how to really fly. All of this was worked out during the First World War.
We can draw a line right back from HMS Furious and those first tentative steps into naval aviation The way that Furious developed is absolutely a straight line through all the other carriers of the Second World War, those famous names, HMS Ark Royal, HMS Hermes, through to HMS Prince of Wales. The way that we have taken forward naval aviation in the last 100 years is as a direct result of the sacrifices that those young men made, like Jack, and we owe a huge debt to them.
This is the true legacy, the importance of carrier air power. The work on board Furious was seminal in starting this off. So Furious's place in history is secure.
HMS Prince of Wales is being built at Rosyth, the same shipyard where work eventually began on refitting Furious as a flush deck carrier. She served with distinction in the next war too. In 1948, she was scrapped. A sad end for the only carrier to serve in both world wars.
In 1919, Jack decided to come home. He had a job to do in Ireland, the family mill. He'd done his bit. It was exciting, it was scary, but he'd done it. He kept in touch with his comrades, crewmates, and he kept up his own personal excitement level by driving sports cars and his connection with the sea by boating. Jack lived a very full life, and I'd love to have met him.
Jack McCleery died at home with a cup of tea in his hand at the grand old age of 85. He was one of the last of the furious few. His story stands witness to what they strove to do, how bravely they tried and died. They blazed a trail for all those who would fly in their wake.
He never talked about the old days or the whys or the wherefores himself. He was very reticent about those war years.
There was no bravado about him, was there? That doesn't seem to come across in his writings. He didn't boast about it.
No, but I think there are a lot of young men who were probably equally brave and courageous. And they didn't all make the grade, of course. He was particularly lucky. He absolutely loved flying, there's no doubt about it.
Jack McCleery was a quiet pioneer. His son and grandsons brought his ashes here to Strangford Lough, the place he loved most. I like to think of him with the wind at his back, out there on the water, in the place where he first learned to fly.